All right, we're back on Morning Line. Thanks for joining us. Talking gun issues with our guest, John Harris with the Tennessee Firearms Association. John, I wanted to ask you this. We've talked before about some of these mass shootings, and certainly we've seen a rash of them lately, unfortunately. I know one point that you tend to focus on, and I know right now lawmakers, especially in D.C., are looking at, certain restrictions on weapons and how that plays out. But your focus a lot of times is on the mental health issue. I wanted to ask you this, and it's kind of concerning. The case out of Indianapolis now, they're looking into whether or not some of the red flag statutes there were not properly looked at closely after the mother of the shooter there actually reported to police that her son, she thought, was going to seek suicide by police. And I guess he may have been talked to, but a judge then ruled, okay, and he's out now. Of course, after the fact, we know what happened in Indianapolis. It's just, I don't want to come down too hard on the judge because, there could be 20 cases like that go before the judge, and 19 of them are probably just people blowing off steam, and then there's the one crazy that decides to actually do it. Are you aware of that situation developing in Indy as they look into that right now? Or if you're hearing about it for the first time, just like your comment on it.
No. I have watched that story because it seems like for the last quarter century that I've been doing this firearms advocacy work, every year, at some point during the year, oftentimes during the legislative cycle, there are, for some reason, these mass public shootings. And we've seen several of them this year that, make the news. And this is one of them. And you're right. One of the factors that we keep bringing up when the left, the progressives, talk about gun control and getting guns off the street is, if the real problem, like this apparently situation in Indiana, is that someone with mental health issues that have been reported to law enforcement go out at some point in the future and commit one of these mass public shootings or violent attacks, do we have adequate laws in place now to protect that person from their mental health condition, as well as to protect the public from the risk that they might, in fact, do something very dangerous like this? And part of the problem is that the U.S. Supreme Court has put severe restrictions on the ability of government to just institutionalize people based upon concerns that they might not be within the normal bell curve of mental health. The other problem is, and I don't know what the law in that jurisdiction is, but let's take Tennessee, for example. We have current statutes on emergency and voluntary committals. And what those statutes provide is that if someone comes to the attention of law enforcement and that person is believed to be an imminent threat of harm to themselves or someone else, they can be assessed by appropriate mental health or medical professionals. A court can involuntarily confine them for up to 2 weeks to be evaluated, tested, and the medical professionals come back and give a report to the court for determination of whether or not further confinement is constitutionally available and justified. And what happens frequently in those is people get taken off the street, they are evaluated, they are calmed down, to some extent medicated, and then they enter into voluntary orders or even court orders where they agree that as a condition of being released back into public, they are going to go through voluntary outpatient treatment and compliance. And then they fail to do it because people tend to, in that situation, think there's nothing wrong with them. And so they don't think they need to see a doctor. They don't think they need to stay on the meds. And we've got this catch-22 of the U.S. Supreme Court putting severe restrictions on how much government can interfere and then to what extent we can force people to get psychiatric treatment or, as an alternative, institutionalize them. And that's part of the problem. I mean, there may have been, in fact, numerous reports that this person had the mental health issues, but there may have been severe constitutional restrictions on the ability of government to do anything about it.
Yeah, you're right. And that's the pickle here. Look, I'm just going to go out on a limb here and say the vast majority of these nut cases, and that's exactly what they are, that do these mass shootings are twisted in some way. I mean, they're not all just rational individuals. I mean, there's something wrong, okay? I'm not trying to give them a pass for that. But so you acknowledge then that that's a good idea, and ignoring the mental aspect is foolish. I mean, that has to be part of it. I mean, I've talked to some other, strong gun advocates who think it needs to be some type of a blending. Anytime some form of gun control comes up, you quickly always go to the mental health aspect of it, which I acknowledge. But don't you think some aspect of that, since we know, because of the limitations, it's limited how much, and you don't always know for sure what someone's going to do. You do your best to do the red flag, but if the mental part of it alone can't take care of it completely, then maybe place some limits on some nut job not being able to get hold of an AK-47.
Well, there are limits, and the limits are in federal law, and they've been there since '68, and the limits require, in order to be constitutionally compliant, that there be, quote, an adjudication, that a court of competent jurisdiction, which could be an administrative law court in the case of, for example, veterans, make a determination based on medical proof that the person has a mental health condition that makes them a threat, an ongoing threat to themselves or others. The problem is, like with the Parkland shooting and the juvenile that was involved, is that from the progressive left, there is a tremendous amount of pressure placed on those institutions and courts not to put people, quote, into the system and blemish their record going forward. So while the left calls for taking the guns out of circulation, they want to leave the people with the mental health problems in circulation. And that's really where I think a lot of the controversy lies, is the risk is from the people who are not mentally stable, and we need to be identifying and treating them with whatever treatment is constitutionally permissible, as opposed to thinking that we can just make it more difficult for them to buy a gun at the retail distribution channels, because they can always, like we saw at a Kroger store here in Nashville recently, they can just go get a knife and do maybe not the same carnage, but just as serious if you're the victim.
Yeah, except I got to stop you there. Every once in a while I hear about it. Well, you had a knife. I don't want to hear any crap from anyone, including you, that a knife is the same as a gun. Yeah, a knife can do a lot. But here, John, I'll take the gun, you get the knife, let's go at it. Guess who wins? It's not you. Period. End of story. So some of these people, well, it's a knife. No, that's crap, all right? A gun wins every single time, unless it jams.
Yeah, it's not a question of which one wins. It's if the problem.
Well, I mean, a gun is worse. A gun is worse every single time. It's worse. You can kill a lot more people with a gun than a knife. Now, I know you can kill a ton of people with a knife, but still, I'm just saying, the damage can be much greater. And it's not, the comparison's ridiculous. Seriously, the buffoons who try to say, well, a knife could have done the same thing are just plumb idiots. A gun does way more potential damage than a knife. I don't even want to hear it. I mean, the people who say that, it's absolutely absurd. And I know you're not saying that.
But the point is, here's the point. If the problem is the person with the mental health issue, then we need to focus on the person and negating that threat, as opposed to thinking that the solution is merely limiting access to one or more tools that are capable of causing serious harm or death. Whether it's a rock, as in Cain and Abel, or a knife, or a sword, as has been the case from the time we learned how to make edge weapons in this world until recent history, or it's with a firearm, or it's with whatever comes next. Maybe it's going to be, laser pointers that are lethal, like in some of the Star Wars movies. It's not the weapon that we have to really focus on. It's the person with the mental health problems, and we need to focus on getting them out of circulation and treated before we let them back in, as opposed to worrying about, can they buy a gun? Because we can't effectively influence that anymore in this country. Yeah, that's tough. Put a law down that says they can't go into a dealer and buy it, but they can steal it just as easy. Yeah, it's got to be kind of a blend. And you would agree, too, though, well, as I said earlier, the vast majority of these mass shootings and the like, there's something wrong with these folks in the head. But there are people out there that commit gun crimes that are
pretty darn rational too, right?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, you can look at, for example, some of the mass shootings that have been, or at least that some people think are terrorist oriented, as opposed to psychiatric.
Yeah.
And if it's terrorist oriented, it's not a mental health. Well, it may be a mental health issue, but these people think that they're on some kind of, call from their God to go out and commit this mass public killing. And you're not going to identify that with red flags or indicators or anything else in advance. They're going to do it.
Yeah, or for instance, and that's a great example there, someone who decides to rob a bank. They're after the money and they shoot someone. Listen, we got to take a break on that note. When we come back, we've got Joe, Ann, and some other calls for John Harris, Tennessee Firearms Association. We'll talk more of these gun issues with him when we come back right after this.